Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to our Saturday session. I wanted to just call out, we had, I think, two incredible must-watch events here this week. One was the conversation with Laura El Borno, who is also known as Gazan Girl on Instagram. She has an incredible following. She is always reporting what's happening on the ground. She has dedicated the vast majority of her adult life to studying and fighting for everything Palestine. She has an incredible podcast called Palestine Pod. But we had the great blessing of having a 2-hour-long conversation, which just flew by, and I think it was, extremely insightful. She's an international human rights lawyer that's working on refugee rights. But I think that, the combination of seeing like what is happening on the ground at the activist level on social media, things getting suppressed, and just her experience in addition to what the Sheikh was able to add for our greater understanding of the history, the theology, but more importantly, for me personally, like when we got into the topic of Jerusalem and the significance of Al-Aqsa Mosque and all of the confusion, the purposeful confusion that's taking place, to hear the Sheikh and have them discuss the point about why Jerusalem, why Al-Aqsa Mosque, why this is something that Muslims should be absolutely unequivocal about and should make their personal mission, was extremely powerful. And I think that was an incredible discussion all around. And then the following day, then we were just incredibly schooled at the Friday khutbah. And I honestly think that this was one of the best. I thought that the khutbah the week before was incredible, that called out racism and the unspeakable truth about what's happening, behind the racism behind the Israeli, Palestine, the Israel massacre on Palestine. Let's be clear about our language. But yesterday's khutbah took it to another level, where you really understand the very intentional attempt to undermine our faith, our belief, our understanding, even our belief that Al-Aqsa Mosque is what it is, what we say it is. It's just, he really went point by point and took us through, and as I was watching, I thought every single Muslim needs to watch this. There were just like lectures within lectures, and it was extremely powerful. So if you do nothing else, watch that khutbah and share it with friends. We're going to spend some time cutting it up into bite-sized chunks so people don't have to, people who can't handle watching a khutbah that is longer than 20 minutes can digest it. But it was rich and deep, and there was so much to it that needed to be unpacked. And I think it's really, really an important initiative for us to make sure that all of our friends watch it and understand what's in it. And on that point, in general, we've been talking about just the level of quality of the khutbahs that take place here, the things that we talk about, how we address issues before they even are on the radar screen of the vast majority of people, things that, obviously are not being talked about in other Muslim spaces. And I'm just going to say, I feel like we could start a revolution if we just could get Muslims to watch this Friday khutbah. It's investing less than an hour a week. If you do nothing else to invest in your own education and your own understanding of Islam, this is how you do it. You don't have to do anything except show up and turn it on YouTube. But we've been talking here about just how these khutbahs and these discussions and hearing the truth have really sparked a passion and a conviction that people have not felt in other spaces. And so I just want to share that with people. I think when we're all here and we're talking about it and we get excited, we want nothing more than to have more people experience it. So, please, share it with your friends, your family, anyone who believes that khutbahs can't actually stir everything inside of you. I think you'll find that you get that here. And lastly, I just wanted to say I've been receiving a lot of really beautiful messages from people who have been, excited about what we do, who want to support us, even people who have asked if they could join us for Project Illumine. And I'm sorry to say, I know, like a lot of people have said, I wish I could be there in person with you. I feel in my heart, I just discovered you. this is something that has transformed my life, and I feel in my heart I want to be with you. I'm really sorry we honestly cannot accommodate more people joining us in person, because we're partway into the project, but that is why we have made it a point to record and make available for free on the internet, made these like interactive group, the YouTube, all of this stuff, so that, if you can't be here in person, at least you can be part of our community virtually. And inshallah, as one day, if things get better with the pandemic, we would love to, try and have more in-person events. Project Illumine, as you know, is a once-in-a-lifetime engagement. We are going through the Quran once. We are not going to do this again. And if we are able to raise money to go on to our dream, which is then covering the Surah, and then even possibly getting into Maqasid al-Sharia, the purposes of Sharia, that is our hope and our goal, to try and raise money for that. So I hope that and maybe in those circumstances we would have the ability to invite student applications again. But for the time being, this is it, and just stay with us, and and just take your time in watching the khutbahs and the halakas, because there's so much there. There's so much learning, and it's extremely valuable. And support us in any way that you can. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to another incredible session, Surah Luqman.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحان الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي يا رب العالمين. So inshallah today we will deal with Surah Luqman. So first, Surah Luqman is Meccan by the agreement of all scholars, all authorities. There are some that said it's Meccan except for 2 ayat towards the end of the surah, although I don't put much weight on these reports. I think Surah Luqman is entirely Meccan from beginning to end. And the reasons cited for a couple of the ayat being Medinian are not convincing. Most authorities say that it was revealed after Surah Al-Saffat. And we get a rather interesting puzzle. It's one of these surah that presents us with a little bit of it's something that's hard to figure out in many ways. In that, if it is revealed after a Safat, as most authorities say, then that would make Luqman a late Meccan revelation. In fact, in all probability, it's so late that it's even after Isra. However, there are various indicators that Luqman is a middle Meccan revelation rather than a late Meccan revelation. In part, it has to do with occasions for revelation. in part, it has to do with the message in Surah Luqman itself. Does it make, in substantively, does it make a big difference? I don't think so. Although it's sometimes, when you try to figure out when a surah was precisely revealed, it's sometimes challenging, and you normally like to be able to pin it down. But a search of the evidence for Surah Luqman makes it very difficult to say with absolute confidence that it's either, whether it's late Meccan or middle Meccan. And anyway, we'll say more about this, about the position of Surah Luqman itself. Now, Surah Luqman is, most reports say that it was revealed well after Surah Maryam. That in order of revelation, it would be among in the high 50s, so that it's maybe number 57 or 56 or 58 in order of revelation. There are many reports that say that it was the surah revealed right before Surah Saba. But if so, that again would make it late Meccan surah. And as we'll talk about the message of Surah Luqman, you can think about whether that message, it coming after the Isra or before the Isra, makes a lot of a difference or not. Okay. Now, Surah Luqman, the one thing that also immediately would get your attention is that it is a surah named after this figure Luqman, who most authorities say was not a prophet. So Luqman was not like Al-Khidr, although we get a lot of disagreements about whether Khidr, who the Quran tells us Moses accompanied him for a period of time, learning from him, whether Khidr was in fact a prophet or not, but we'll get to that inshallah. But Luqman, most agree, was not a prophet. There are some authorities that said Luqman was a prophet, but that's not very likely. That's not very likely true. Some authorities said that he was related to the prophet Yunus, Job, but that's also not, that's rather speculative. The evidence for that is, now what is interesting about Luqman is that as a figure, he seemed to have been known to Arabs before the Islamic revelation. So, and the reason we know that is that in Nabigha Zubyani, who are among the very famous poets of pre-Islam, mentions Luqman in one of his poetry. And he is mentioned, at least in Nabigha Zubyani's poem, as a man that represented wisdom and dignity. Who was Luqman precisely? It's very difficult to say. There are numerous reports that say that he was either Sudanese or Egyptian. Beyond that, you get a lot of, everything from what he did for a living, when precisely did he live, but there is a figure in the collective memory of Arabs who seem to have been highly revered, highly respected, for his wisdom and for his moral character. And like a lot of these figures in pre-Islamic literature, we would have tended to say, well, he's perhaps a mythological figure if it hadn't been for the fact that the Quran mentions him. And by mentioning him, confirming his existence as an actual human being. But as Surat Luqman makes clear, or the Quran says that we gave Luqman wisdom, hikmah, not a nubuwwah. It doesn't say anything about a prophecy. So does that make a difference that he is in a human being who's not a prophet? As we'll see, I think it does. I think it does make a difference. And so he is a standout figure because all the surah that are named after a person are named after prophets. The only two possible exceptions are Luqman and Maryam. And we've talked about Maryam. And of course, Maryam has a very special status. And then the other figure is Luqman. We will note another thing. I'll approach this surah a little bit differently than I approach a lot of surah. We notice that in this surah, that there is, it's a fairly short surah, it's just 34 ayat or 35 depending on but it mentions in the Surah Luqman mentions the word hikmah several times in a fairly short surah. And hikmah is mentioned in Surah Luqman, which means wisdom, in reference to God's book, Kitabun Hakim, that this is a book of wisdom. It is mentioned in reference to God, Al-Aziz Al-Hakim, that Allah, God's self, is Hakim. And then it is mentioned in reference to Luqman, وَآتَيْنَا لُقْمَانَ الْحِكْمَةِ, that we gave Luqman wisdom. So you have the book of wisdom, the God of wisdom, and Luqman, a man of wisdom. And other than wisdom, we also have in Surah Luqman an emphasis on the concept of ihsan. So, which is, we'll talk about what ihsan is, but for now let's say ihsan as the basic concept of goodness. And there is a dynamic that is going on between hikmah, wisdom, and ihsan, and concept of goodness in Surah Luqman that is fascinating. So keep that in mind. Keep these two concepts in mind as we delve into the surah. The other thing I should mention at the beginning also is that in Arabic mythology, you get a lot of, as I said, sort of contradictory narratives about who Luqman was, what Luqman did, and what's Luqman's legacy. And a lot of the reports a lot of the mythology that surrounds Luqman often portrays him as someone of sort of wit and sharp intelligence, but whether they have anything to do with the actual figure or not, we don't know. And there's really no way to know. Because a lot of these reports, I mean, a lot of the stories that are told about Luqman in Arabic mythology, the identical report is told about a different person. So the same acts are attributed to a different person, and the only difference is the name of the figure. So what's interesting, and it can't escape our notice, is that when the Quran talks about Luqman and talks about what Luqman did, it chooses something that none of the surviving Arab mythology, pre-Islamic mythology, emphasized. So you have a body of literature, pre-Islamic mythology, and it talks about Luqman, and it talks about Luqman, as doing X, Y, Z, but the Quran comes in and it doesn't pick any of that. And it mentions something about him that none of the mythology at all mentions. And that's his role in raising his child. And this is something that gave me a long pause. Not Luqman as a sheep herder, as in some reports, or as a merchant in some reports, or as a judge in some reports, because some reports has him as a judge. Some reports even say that he was a warrior. Not likely, but anyway. But Luqman as a father. And that, when you dig in the tradition long enough and hard enough, you find that this didn't escape the Arabs who was receiving the revelation. They didn't know Luqman as a parental figure, if you will. There are so many conflicting reports as to who his son was that we can't even get the name of his son right. But as we will see, this actually turns out to be very important for Surah Luqman and what Surah Luqman is about. And for our understanding of the role of wisdom and the concept of hikmah itself. So the surah, where is my study? So the surah starts out with Alif Lam Mim, and we've talked about Alif Lam Mim before. Among the if I remember correctly, the 29th surah in the Quran that start with Alif Lam Mim. But so I won't pause. So here is the first mention of the word, a derivation of the word hikmah. تلك آيات الكتاب الحكيم. These are the verses of the book of wisdom. Okay. هدى ورحمة للمحسنين. So immediately in the first two verses we have al-hikmah and al-ihsan. هدى ورحمة للمحسنين, guidance and mercy to those people of ihsan. الذين يقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة وهم بالآخرة هم يوقنون. Those who uphold their prayers, ويؤتون الزكاة, those people who insisted that Luqman is a later revelation, said in part because of the mention of the word zakah, and they said zakah was a later it was a later order in the Quran. However, that's not entirely true, because zakah is used in the early Quran, in the entire Meccan period, in fact, not as zakat al-amwal, that is 2.5% of ما يحول عليه الحول, what you save for a year, etc., etc. But it is used in the Quran as effectively the equivalent of sadaqah. The entire Meccan period, the word zakah, and in fact, I mean, I think that it is unfortunate that zakah later on in the minds of Muslims become confined to that sum that they pay annually, because zakah is far more central to Islamic theology than that. So those who do their prayers, give of their money, and they are certain of the hereafter. Is this a definition of ihsan? Not quite. It is part of the attributes of those who are characterized by ihsan, al-muhsinin. So you could say they are components of what would be required of someone that can be said to have ihsan, but they don't necessarily describe the entire phenomena of ihsan. Okay. Okay. أولئك على هدى من ربهم وأولئك هم المفلحون. Those are the ones who are guided, and those are the ones who are successful, who are aided by God. So this is the opening salvo of Surah Luqman. These first 5 ayat, and then ومن الناس من يشتري له الحديث ليضل عن سبيل الله بغير علم ويتخذها هزوا أولئك لهم عذاب مهين وإذا تتلى عليه آياتنا ولى مستكبرا كأن لم يسمعها كأن في أذنيه وقرا فبشره بعذاب أليم. So from that, Surah Luqman immediately talks about a type of people and refers to those who focus on lahu al-hadith. And the question is, what is lahu al-hadith? In the study Quran says, idle discourse, to lead astray from the way of God without knowledge, and who take it in mockery. For them there shall be humiliating punishment, and when our signs are recited unto them, they turn away arrogantly, as if they did not hear them, as if there were deafness in their ears. So give them glad tidings of a painful punishment. Of course, glad tidings of a painful punishment is mocking them. فَبَشِّرْهُ بِعَذَابٍ أَلِيمٍ. It's a way of mocking what they have to wait for. Before we get to this part, though, I should say something more about, a little bit more about ihsan at this point. There is a very famous hadith in which reportedly a man comes to the Prophet ﷺ, and the man asks the Prophet, tell me what ihsan is. And the Prophet ﷺ says, ihsan is that you worship God as if you see God. And if you don't see God, then you know that God sees you. And to love for people what you love for yourself. To want for people what you want for yourself. And then this man says, you're correct. And of course the companions are surprised by the response of this man. And the Prophet says, well, this was Gabriel who came to teach you your religion. And it's very commonly cited, and it's among the building components, if you will, in understanding ihsan, the understanding that concept itself, that you have a relationship with God where you treat God as if you see God, and you are fully aware all the time that God sees you, and that you want for people what you would want for yourself. And that's, both of them are very challenging, because we often hear that, but to actually implement it, to turn it into real life, human beings are remarkably adept at convincing themselves that they treat others as they would like to be treated, while in reality they don't. But there's another thing about ihsan, that when we know from various discourses in the Quran and Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that there is rahmah is also a part of ihsan, that mercy, compassion is also an important building block of ihsan. So rahmatullah qaribun min al-muhsinin, that Allah's mercy is always close to those who are possessed of ihsan. And so often in the Quran we find that rahmah and ihsan are coupled together. So for instance, I mean, Huda wa Rahma lil Muhsineen, which is verse number 3 in Surah Luqman itself. Okay, so this concept of lahu al hadith, there is um, um, an a narrative about Mudar ibn al-Haris, or his name has been reported as Ibn al-Haris or Ibn Harth, either, that a Mudar who was an opponent of the Prophet ﷺ, very much an enemy of the Islamic revelation, and a Mudar was a strange fellow. The reports are is that Mudar believed or expected that he would be a prophet, and when his aspirations of being a prophet didn't materialize, it didn't work out for a variety of reasons. There's also reports that at one time he wanted to be appointed the king of the Arabs, but that didn't work out either, because Mecca would accept no king, and no one really had the authority to appoint him as a king, and he reportedly went to the Persians and said, delegate me as the king over Mecca, and they did, but you know everyone just ignored it. But anyway, what al-Mudar does is that he goes around when collecting the mythology, or the mythologies, the superstitions of ancient people, especially Persian stories about Rustum and Isfandiar and Khosrow and things like that. And he would go back to Mecca and he would tell them, Muhammad tells you these stories in the Quran about Ad and Thamud and Qawm of Fir'aun and so on and so forth. I have more entertaining stories than Muhammad. Let me tell you about Rustum and Isfandiar and Khosrow, and there are even some reports that he bought singing slave girls and would go to young men who he thought were being attracted by the Islamic message, and he would say, I'll let you have sex with my slave girl if you would forget about Islam. So a rather colorful figure. And so his main thing was to say, my superstitious my narratives of these ancient superstitions beat the narratives of Muhammad, and stop listening to Muhammad and come, I can entertain you better. So there are various reports that say that this verse was revealed in response to Mudar. And so Lahu al-Hadith, meaning that there are people who attempt to distract human beings from God's revelation, from focusing on God's book, by bringing in stories of old mythology and superstition and singing slave girls, in order to distract people. what An-Nadr did, and if this is true, and this is if it is true that this revelation was a response to An-Nadr, then this would make Surat Luqman a mid-Meccan revelation. Because what An-Nadr did was around the mid-Meccan period, not the late Meccan period. Now, it is in all likelihood An-Nadr did what it is reported that he did. And in all likelihood that he was guilty of everything that was reported about him. But I don't think that this ayah was revealed to address what An-Nadr did. It applies, and I think that later scholars of the Quran said this seems to apply. So they sort of matched it. But there is many different reasons to believe that the revelation, this Quranic revelation, applies far more broadly than to the narratives of Rustum and Isfandiyar and the whole episode was An-Nadr ibn al-Harith or Ibn al-Harith, depending on the report. ومن الناس من يشتري لهو الحديث ليضل عن سبيل الله بغير علم ويتخذها هزوا أولئك لهم عذاب مهين. There are people who yashtari could be purchase, could be goes and spends money to purchase, and ishtari could be focus and derive and emphasize law al-hadith. Now, law al-hadith, notice here, لِيُضِلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, to lead people astray. Well, there are a lot of things that you can do to engage in a discourse to lead people astray. It could be of the variety of what Nadr did, but it could also be even using the Quran itself to lead people astray. So we have a report that later on the hypocrites of Mecca would in prayer loved to focus on the hypocrites of Mecca loved to focus on Surat Abasa wa Tawalla, because it seemed to criticize the Prophet. And so they would constantly recite Abasa wa Tawalla in their prayers, to the point that there is a narrative that Umar ibn al-Khattab gets so fed up with it that he wants to go beat up anyone that's reciting Abasa wa Tawalla in prayer among the hypocrites, and of course he's told he can't. And then, and there are a lot, even after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, there Abasa wa Tawalla has this sort of, but يشتري لهو الحديث ليضل عن سبيل الله. Any time a human being is not focused on, as we will see, on hikmah and ihsan, and as we will see, ilm. Anytime that a human being is not focused on wisdom and goodness and ilm, knowledge, as venues to the divine, and uses their are premised or anchored in their ignorance. So they are not anchored in actual knowledge, but because of their ignorance, they are leading people astray. This verse applies. Now, I've got to tell you something about this verse that's rather interesting. All the schools of thought in Islamic history that prohibited music rely on this verse. And for many, many years, when you talk to the Wahhabis and they say music is haram in Islam, and you tell them why is music is haram, they always point you to this verse, Lahu al-Hadith. And of course, it says Lahu al-Hadith, it doesn't say music, but they would say, there is a hadith that says that Lahu al-Hadith is effectively singing or music. But it's not an authentic hadith, but and even the Wahhabis know it's not an authentic hadith, because even Albani said it's not authentic, but nevertheless. Now, but notice here, the whole debate about music goes back to Lahu al-Hadith liyudilla an sabilillah, to lead people astray. If you are performing music with the purpose you intend to lead people astray, then this applies to you. If you listen to music and instead of this music bringing you closer to God, it makes you drift away from God, then this verse applies to you. So, and this is not my position, this is a position that so many scholars said before, including Ghazali, for instance, who wrote on this. And so many of the Sufi scholars have had the same position, that, well, it depends on the music. Some music brings you closer to God, and some music makes you drift away from God. And I do believe that music is a very, very powerful agent. Music has the power to do miracles. It can truly tenderize your heart and make you a better human being and make you more open to the divine. And it can also do exactly the opposite. It can take you into... So, I mean, in my view, to go from prohibiting music to Nicki Minaj, I mean, I find it very difficult to imagine that Nicki Minaj's music is going to get you closer to God. I mean, I admit that I'm not very not very learned about Nicki Minaj's corpus of musical compositions, but nevertheless, what little I've heard, I have doesn't make me very convinced that I want to learn more. But Lahu al-Hadith is broader than music. So it's, even if you use philosophy, if you use philosophical discourse to confuse people and to convince them that how do you know that there is God, and how do you know that there is a purpose for your life, and how do you know that there is a truth, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. If you engage in speech that is superficial, And in fact, I mean, listen, even talking about politics, and this is my if you listen to the khutbah that Grace was talking about yesterday, this is my problem with the whole thing of saying political Islam is bad, is that if you talk about politics and your purpose is to serve God, then this doesn't apply to you. But if you talk about politics and your purpose is not to serve God, then you could very well fall under this. So the idea that somehow you can, and this is a one of these moral imperatives that is truly demands our notice. Okay. And then there is a very interesting theological / juristic discourse on whether, when verse 7 it says وَإِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِ آيَاتُنَا وَلَّا مُسْتَكْبِرًا كَأَنْ لَمْ يَسْمَعْهَا كَأَنَّ فِي أُذُنَيْهِ وَقْرًا فَبَشِّرْهُ بِعَذَابٍ أَلِيمٍ. Now 7 says that, and if these people listen to our verses, they walk away as if they haven't heard them, didn't hear anything, and they walk away arrogantly, and as if their ears are plugged. So there's a juristic theological discussion as to, is it enough that the discourse would distract from Allah, or do you don't deserve this severe reprimand unless your discourse distracts from Allah and you are also oblivious and refuse to listen to what Allah has to say? I believe that this description is not necessarily tied to that lahu al-hadith is sufficient to condemn a person. This description is an added offense, in my view. In my view, anyway. Okay. So, we understand the reports about the possible occasions for revelation. We understand that it is alerting you to a phenomena of the way people talk and the way that talking can distract from this revelation. And what is this revelation? It is a revelation of hikmah, of wisdom, so it will distract from wisdom, and it is a revelation for al-muhsinin, for those who are embrace ihsan, those who do goodness. As we will see, this is going to be important for the entire thing. Okay. Alright, so إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ لَهُمْ جَنَّاتُ النَّعِيمِ. Those who believe and do good, they'll be rewarded with heaven. خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا وَعْدَ اللَّهِ حَقًّا وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. This is God's promise, and again we see the word hikmah repeated. Allah al-Aziz, the omnipotent, what is how they translate it? Yeah, omnipotent, the mighty, al-Hakim. Again, the most wise, the most invoking the idea of wisdom again. Okay. خلق السماوات بغير عمد ترونها وألقى في الأرض رواسي أن تميد بكم وبث فيها من كل دابة وأنزلنا من السماء ماء فأنبتنا فيها من كل زوج كريم. And we've encountered this in Surah Al-Ra'd, and it will be a repeated theme in the Quran. Verse 10, that if you reflect upon creation, you will see the signs of God everywhere. It's often difficult to explain to the modern mind how unusual the idea of noticing, or the idea that the text talks about the heavens as a ceiling. The pre-modern mind didn't think that there was anything such an ozone layer or an artificial heaven or an artificial atmosphere that surrounds Earth. It was just the way it is. I mean, in the pre-modern mind or the ancient mind, they believe that wherever you go, there's just going to be air that you breathe. The fact that the Quran consistently kept saying that this is not some small thing. This is actually miraculous, that you're enveloped by a special heaven that allows you to live, and that it exists without pillars, which we now we understand that gravity holds it and so on. It's quite remarkable. I mean, and even the idea that in order for the crust of the earth to be stable, it needed to be anchored with mountains, was also quite incredible, because it was, and it's very funny when you read in medieval texts where they debate whether, is it real that the crust of the earth would have needed mountains? Are mountains just decoration, and God is just saying this to sort of impress us? Because also in the medieval mind, they believed that there were only 7 major mountains around the world, and they would name the 7 mountains. So I mean, these things about the Quran that are fascinating. Okay. And verse 11, this is Allah's creation. هذا خلق الله فأروني ماذا خلق الذين من دونه. This is God's creation, and again inviting you or calling upon you to reflect about the created Quran, the Quran of that surrounds us all the time. Then it introduces the figure of Luqman. And it tells you, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا لُقْمَانَ الْحِكْمَةَ أَنْ أَشْكُرْ لِلَّهِ وَمَنْ يَشْكُرْ فَإِنَّمَا يَشْكُرُ لِنَفْسِهِ وَمَنْ كَفَرَ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَنِيٌّ حَمِيدٌ. So it tells you we've given Luqman wisdom. This is 12, right?
Yeah.
Luqman wisdom. We've given Luqman wisdom. So Luqman, the wisdom that Luqman has been given is that Luqman understands the value of gratitude to God, and understands that that moral value of gratitude vis-a-vis God is not for God's benefit, but like all moral values, it elevates the holder of the moral value itself. This, if Luqman was not a prophet, so it gave rise to a discussion in the Islamic tradition. So, and this discussion, by the way, becomes very material in inspiring the centuries later the narrative of Hayban Yaqzan, the narrative of which Robinson Crusoe is based on, the man who travels to an island, and in the island he starts thinking about morality as an individual. So in other words, the whole thing about the relationship between virtue and revelation. And so Luqman is not a prophet, so he's not receiving revelation. Does he know by the virtue of correct logic that gratitude is a moral virtue in itself, and that gratitude must begin with acknowledging your gratitude towards your Maker? That unless you start with that genesis, that starting point of gratitude towards the Maker, who's constantly supplying you with everything that you have, your health, your body, your mind, and as Surah Luqman will tell us at the end, that in fact God's gifts, God's wisdom is so numerous that it is literally unthinkable. It's hard to grasp. But so if you are existing surrounded by constant gifts, if you don't start with the premise of gratitude towards these gifts, can you be a virtuous human being otherwise? So, if I am not, if as a human being, let's say I'm a child who is extremely ungrateful to my very giving mother who's given me everything, but I am very nice to my friends, can I be described as a person of ihsan, a person of goodness? Am I a good person? This, of course, becomes very important in the whole trajectory of Islamic philosophy, that, well, can we ignore gratitude, and can we ignore our relationship with God and take morality from that point on? So let's leave God out of it and be virtuous otherwise. And of course, the entire Islamic theology and philosophy is built on the argument that you can't. Some Muslim authorities were so troubled by the idea that Luqman would reason independently, without revelation, to reach the conclusion that all virtue must begin with gratitude, that they there's a narrative that is definitely apocryphal. It's definitely circulated, invented. That Luqman was offered, that Gabriel came to Luqman and said, God is giving you a choice. You can be a wise person or you can be a prophet. And that Luqman chose to be a wise person because he didn't want to deal with the challenge of being a prophet. The reason you have that narrative is that it was circulated as a response to the anxiety, especially over what people like later on Qadi Abdul Jabbar, for instance, would do with the Luqman narrative. So it was circulated in part in response to the type of debates and discourses that some of Ahl al-Hadith was seeing going on around this whole thing of Atayna Luqman al-Hikmah. And, you know, because they very much wanted to argue that the path to God entirely depends on revelation, and that you wouldn't find God without revelation, which, you know, is a misguided. I understand their intentions, but it's rather, you know, misguided anyway. But they feared that if you can say that you can reach God without revelation, that would make revelation marginal in importance, and so that's why they, you know, that created a lot of anxiety among them. Anyway, all right. So Luqman is flagged as this person who is anchored in understanding the beginning of virtue, and the beginning of virtue is gratitude, and a human being who's ungrateful cannot be a moral human being. A human being who does not understand gratitude, but not gratitude in the sense of, oh yeah, you know, I'm grateful. No, actually understanding what gratitude is. Because if I am giving you a gift every day, right, and you say thank you on the first day, and then I give you a gift on the second and third and fourth and fifth day, and then I say, why aren't you saying thank you? And you say, well, I told you thank you the first day. That doesn't mean you're grateful. So how often are you receiving gifts from Allah? And how often do you need to say thank you? So how often do you need to feel gratitude? So a lot of people believe they're being grateful, but they're actually not being grateful. But as we will see, the nature of gratitude also translates to how you understand your relationship to ihsan, to all goodness. How you understand gratitude to your parents, to your loved ones, to your teacher, to all relationships where gratitude is owed. Oh, okay. And then right away, the Quran doesn't take any of the narratives about Luqman, but right away focuses on Luqman as a teacher. And a teacher to his son. His role as an educator. And this is very significant for Surah Luqman, and it's very significant for Arabs at the time who are entitled. We're going to pause for those who haven't prayed Asr. I've prayed, but Chief says some people here haven't prayed. So we're going to take a break for Asr, and 5 minutes, inshallah, we'll come back. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Interestingly, among the hadith that you often encounter in the context of Surah Luqman, is the hadith لا تبيعوا القينات ولا تشتروهن ولا خير في تجارة فيهن وثمنهن حرام, which this relates to the whole issue of slavery, because in this hadith attributed to the Prophet, the Prophet prohibits buying or selling qayinat, or entertainment girls, and says that ثمنهن haram, that the money, that whether spending money or receiving money is haram for that purpose. Again, the issue that receives such miserable treatment among modern Muslims, the issue of Islam and slavery, because at least what I've seen published in recent years in English about this topic is just very disappointing. There's so much in the Islamic tradition that is clearly hostile to the whole institution of slavery, but for whatever reason, these Muslims who've written these books ignore that tradition. Okay, so وَإِذْ قَالَ لُقْمَانُ لِابْنِهِ وَهُوَ يَعِظُهُ يَا بُنَيَّ لَا تُشْرِكْ بِاللَّهِ إِنَّ الشِّرْكَ لَظُلْمٌ عَظِيمٌ. So, first, just think about the role that Luqman, the Quran talks about Luqman occupying. Luqman as an educator. And this is an important point, is that Luqman is given wisdom. And what he does with this wisdom, at least according to the Quran, it doesn't pay attention to any of the narratives about his heroic deeds or whatever. No, it's his role as an educator that is given emphasis. Or as a parent, which is noteworthy. Because if, again, the surahs that are revealed in the Meccan period, these formative surahs, so much of Surah Luqman has to do with parenting, with being a parent. And being a parent endowed with wisdom using that wisdom to parent is what earns Luqman the status of being possibly the only non-prophet, if Maryam is not a prophet, then the only male non-prophet that is mentioned in the Quran. And that's no small thing, that parenting itself is an institution. And as we see in the what so much of what Luqman imparts to his son, So Luqman first says, don't associate partners with God, because associating partners with God, shirk, الظلم عظيم, it's a great injustice. It's an injustice of lack of gratitude and an injustice of lack of intelligence, because the entire creation testifies to the oneness of God, that there is a single maker, and insisting that there is an omnipotent power other than that one God is nothing but whim. You're insisting about something that derives from nothing but fantasy. Okay. And from that lesson about gratitude, immediately, so gratitude starts with your very first relationship, and that's a relationship with your Maker. Then gratitude, it's immediately the second relationship. وصينا الإنسان بوالديه حملته أمه وهنا على وهن وفصاله في عامين أن اشكر لي ولوالديك إلي المصير. So this is 14. What? And so gratitude towards Allah, gratitude towards your parents, and notice the role of the father and the role of the teacher in 14 is intentionally made ambiguous, because it says, "Oh, anashkur li." It's as if Allah is talking, but it's but it's Luqman who is teaching his son. Which, and we'll try this whole theme of gratitude in a bit. Okay. So then, وَإِنْ جَاهَدَاكَ عَلَى أَنْ تُشْرِكَ بِي مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ فَلَا تُطِعْهُمَا وَصَاحِبْهُمَا فِي الدُّنْيَا مَعْرُوفًا وَاتَّبِعْ سَبِيلَ مَنْ أَنَابَ إِلَيَّ ثُمَّ إِلَيَّ مَرْجِعُكُمْ فَأُنْبِئُكُمْ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ تَعْمَلُونَ. So, gratitude towards the parents doesn't mean obedience, obeying your parents, if it is shirk, if it is associating partners with God, if it is, and as so many theologians and commentators said, that it goes beyond, but if it is anything that involves disobeying God. So gratitude is differentiated from blind obedience. Being able to be grateful, to acknowledge what venues of gratitude or lines of gratitude, but at the same time, blind obedience, as we will see in Surah Luqman, is not the point, and is in fact an immoral act. So if they command you to associate partners, don't obey, but be kind to them. صاحبهما في الدنيا معروفة means be gracious, be kind. واتبع سبيل من أناب إليك, and follow the path of those who return to their Lord. Because ultimately you will all return to me, and I will resolve disputes between them. Of course, there is a narrative that is often related in the context of this verse. And it has to do with Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, who, when he converted to Islam, his mother swore that she would not eat or drink until he left the faith. And he refused to do so, and she continued to fast for, in most reports say 3 days, some reports say until she fainted. And often it is said that this was the occasion for revelation. Whether it's an occasion for revelation or simply a situation that applies, Allahu Alam. But in so much of the theological discourse, it is from that the extrapolation that gratitude does not mean obedience in what is wrong, in what you believe to be wrong, including the situation that a lot of shuyukh dealt with and a lot of fatawa was Amr al-walidain and la ya'ti al-fata shaykhu is the label in a lot of the fatawa literature, that parents would order their child not to study with a certain scholar. And the issue was whether parents had that right to order a child not to study with a scholar. And the vast majority of muftis said that they don't. That in any fard ayn, in any individual obligation, talab al-ilm, seeking knowledge, is an individual obligation. And therefore, if you have an obligation to seek knowledge, you must seek knowledge with who you believe is going to educate you. Now, of course, it's different if it's, someone who's going to teach you dancing or something like that. That most of these scholars were talking about. But that same logic can be extended to any matter, in my opinion, to any matter that involves ethics and virtue. The relationship of gratitude, which we'll talk about taqleed in a second. The relationship of gratitude does not ever mean that you no longer think about what is ethical and what is right. The obligation to live a virtuous life, to be among the muhsineen, remains and supersedes any relationship in which you believe there is a necessity for obedience. Okay. So that's the first instruction to the son. يا بني إنها إن تكن مثقال حبة من خردل فتكن في صخرة أو في السماوات أو في الأرض يأتي بها الله إن الله لطيف خبير. Let's see how they translate this. 16. If it be the weight of a mustard seed, be it in a rock in the heavens or in the earth, God will bring it forth. Truly, God, Latif. Latif is benevolent. Khabir is knowledgeable. Khabir is an expertise in knowledge. To know everything is Khabir. Okay. So the awareness of God's omnipotence and God's power and God's that everything that transpires in our world is in God's full knowledge, is the second moral lesson. يا بني أقم الصلاة وأمر بالمعروف وانهى عن المنكر واصبر على ما أصابك إن ذلك من عزم الأمور. Prayer, وأمر بالمعروف وانهى عن المنكر. Live a life in which you actively seek to establish goodness. That's what أمر بالمعروف. وانهى عن المنكر, live a life in which you actively seek to resist evil. واصبر على ما أصابك, and persevere and endure. إن ذلك من عزم الأمور. Now, من عزم الأمور means what? Let me first see how they translated it. 17. Resolve. They said, indeed, a course worthy of resolve. That course where you are going to hold on to prayer, but you are going to seek a life where you pursue goodness, to establish goodness, and actively resist what is wrong, will inevitably lead to hardship. And the only response to that hardship is sabr, meaning perseverance, not abandonment of the course of conduct of establishing good and resisting evil. And azm al-umur means the things that you hold steadfast to as you confront all types of hardships. So you need a powerful resolve to adhere to it. The grammatician al-Mubarrad said that azm and hazm al-umur, that the hazm is the type of resolve that you acquire in your intentionality, and azm is the resolve in application. So, and in al-Mubarrad it says that azm and hazm can be used interchangeably with that differentiation, that it is not just, so azm is a step beyond hazm, and I think that it is not just that you have a strong resolve within, but that resolve become an earmark of the way that you apply yourself in life. Now, prayer as an expression of gratitude and as a form of remembrance. So, gratitude needs remembrance. So you cannot say, I am grateful to my parents if you don't remember your parents. And you can't say, I am grateful to my teacher if you don't remember your teacher. And you can't say, I am grateful to anything if you don't remember what you've been given. So, beyond remembrance is the way you express that gratitude. But remembrance is a necessary element for the gratitude. But beyond that, notice that Luqman, who is not a prophet, is, according to, in Surah Luqman, is supposed to become aware that virtue, ihsan, is not possible unless you live an active life where you fight for goodness and you fight against evil. And that persevering in that path. This is, by the way, one of the most remarkable, if you read the Summa by Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas Aquinas says, the very first obligation of natural law is to do good and to resist evil. Al-amr ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. It's written centuries later. It's right here. Thomas Aquinas read the Quran. We know that. All natural law, by the way, is derived from that very first primary duty, to do good and to resist what is not good. And then everything else is derived from that. Okay. Then, وَلَا تُصَعِّرْ خَدَّكَ لِلنَّاسِ وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ كُلَّ مُخْتَالٍ فَخُورٍ. تُصَعِّرْ خَدَّكَ لِلنَّاسِ. This is 18. Turn not your cheek at men in scorn, nor walk exaltedly upon the earth. Tusa'ar khaddaka linnas is actually something that people do more often than they realize. Often when people, they do it subconsciously quite often. When they want to subconsciously reject something that their psyche is not accepting, what they'll do is they'll turn their head like that and they'll give their side towards whatever it is. And people do this all the time. Most of the time, actually, subconsciously. So if you meet someone that you're not happy at seeing, the first thing you're really aching to do is to turn your head to look elsewhere. And tusa'ir khaddaka linnas is when you are met with those that, for whatever reason, you think you are higher than, you're more worthy than, you're whatever it is. And you find yourself, the inner inclination is to turn away and sort of give them the side of your face. That's tusa'ir khaddaka linnas. It doesn't need to be in scorn. So that is why in Sufi-esque tafsir they talk a lot about that among the disciplines of a Sufi is to learn not to do that. To actually learn to look at what you find unpleasant to look at. And to learn from it whatever you need to learn from it. But that turning away is, and especially if it's turning away in arrogance, which is more subtle than people realize. Now, al-mukhtal al-fakhur, of course, is beyond, mukhtal fakhur is someone who's just full of themselves. That's literally a mukhtal fakhur, someone who's full of themselves. They think they are more important. They think they are special. They think they are chosen. They think they are God's gift. They think that they're, and it doesn't necessarily correlate to the amount of wealth or the amount of knowledge or family position, or a lot of times this type of narcissism is irrational. It is just is. And it is a disease. And you this type of vain glory, as it's often called, especially in translations, is something that you fight in yourself like you fight an infection. Okay. وَقْصِدْ فِي مَشِيكَ. وَقْصِدْ فِي مَشِيكَ means, it doesn't mean walk slow or fast, as some have thought it does. It's not. وَقْصِدْ فِي مَشِيكَ means walk plainly. You don't, if those who travel, like a lot of the leaders of the dictatorial countries, they travel in huge caravans. It's a show. They violate وَقْصِدْ فِي مَشِيكَ. Every time you travel, making a show out of it, you're violating this Quranic command. Now, what's the show depends on the circumstance. If you make it a point to wear clothes that's very expensive, so that everyone will look at you and see how expensive your clothes is, you're violating this Quranic command. If you're, making sure that you travel with an entourage, waqsid fi mashika is something that also violated by a lot of shuyukh, by the way. A lot of shuyukh like to travel around with an entourage. Look at how important I am. I have all my disciples. They're violating the Quranic command. Because no matter how much they try to feign modesty and humility, their method of travel, their way of communicating who they are as they travel, is vainglory again. So many Muslim leaders and Muslim teachers and Muslim whatever, if they learn the Quran, if they internalize the Quran, it would resolve so many of our immoralities. You read some strange stuff like don't walk too fast or too slow. Well, as there are a lot of Aisha said that the Prophet used to walk fast. So did he violate the Quranic command? Obviously not, because waqsid fi mashka doesn't mean walk either fast or slow. That has nothing to do with it. Okay. وَغْضُضْ مِنْ صَوْتِكَ إِنَّ أَنْكَرَ الْأَصْوَاتِ لَصَوْتُ الْحَمِيرِ. Now, this is one of those very famous Quranic verses. Lower your voice because one of the worst voices are voices of donkeys. And it is not referring, as some thought it does, to people who are raising their voice because they're joking around, or that's not what the Quran is saying sounds like a donkey. It is when you start yelling and screaming, because when you yell and scream, the noise you emit is irritating and disruptive and dissonant, like the voice of a donkey. In the tradition, in some tafsir you read that a donkey, what is when the donkey makes a sound, is it called braying?
Yeah.
A donkey brays when a donkey sees a devil and stuff like that. You can ignore that stuff. It's not. None of it is reliable. That the only time a donkey prays is when he sees a demon, and that all other animals, when they emit a sound, they're doing tasbih, but except for the poor donkey, when he emits a sound, he's not doing tasbih. Again, the poor donkey. God didn't mean to say the donkey sees demons, or that the donkey is not making tasbih, or God is saying that you sound like a freaking donkey when you yell. That's all. Okay. To this point, the Wasiyyat Luqman Libnihi ends. So this is where the Luqman's lesson to his son comes to an end. Is with that. So remember, Luqman is given hikmah, right? And wisdom. And that wisdom, and we believe all wisdom is a gift from God. And that wisdom is premised on ihsan, on the ability to manifest goodness. Without goodness, there is no wisdom. But what else does wisdom need that we find emphasized in Surah Luqman? Well, several times we find Inna Allah latifun khabir, Inna Allah bima ta'maluna khabir, Inna Allah alimun khabir. That theme of al-khabir, knowledge, learning. And as we will see, Surah Luqman tells us about those who argue without knowledge. So, hikmah is premised on ihsan in part, on ihsan and on knowledge. And that hikmah, that wisdom that is necessary imparts a very basic moral lesson that Luqman it's put in the mouth of Luqman as teaching his son. Virtue starts with gratitude, gratitude in your relationship with your maker, gratitude in your relationships with everything worthy of gratitude, the ability to express that gratitude in thankfulness, and in remembrance, and then the moral lesson from this wisdom is that you are a person of humility and a person who does not imagine himself or herself above others or in a privileged position beyond others. A person who treats other human beings with this ihsan, that you're not giving them, you're not above them, you're not beyond them, you are kind to them, and a commitment to the objective of goodness and resistance of evil and wrongdoing in wherever you are, and that you are going to persevere in this path, and that you're simply not going to give up. And then Surah Luqman then shifts gear to speak to us after telling us about Luqman. So don't you see that Allah has given you everything in the heavens and on earth, and has given you ni'mah zahira wa batina, that blessings that you easily perceive and blessings that you don't easily perceive. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يُجَادِلُ فِي اللَّهِ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ وَلَا هُدَى وَلَا كِتَابٍ مُنِيرٍ. And yet, there are people that dispute about God without knowledge, without guidance, and without وَلَا كِتَابٍ وَلَا كِتَابٍ مُنِيرٍ, without an enlightening book. Okay, so, yeah, I'm skipping ahead of myself a little bit, so, let's go. So we're at 20, right? وإذا قيل لهم اتبعوا ما أنزل الله قالوا بل نتبع ما وجدنا عليه آباءنا ولو كان الشيطان يدعوهم إلى عذاب السعير. So there, note here that theme of when they are told to follow God's guidance, they say, no, we follow what our parents are doing. Read this in the context of Luqman's discourse about honoring parents. So the excuse that I was following what my parents taught me or what my parents are doing is not going to work. من يسلم وجهه إلى الله وهو محسن فقد استمسك بالعروة الوثقى. So now again on that theme of ihsan, whoever surrenders to God وهو محسن, and in the state of ihsan, doing good, فقد استمسك بالعروة الوثقى. بالعروة الوثقى, they probably, how did they translate this? 22. Unfailing handhold. Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa is the study Quran translated it as unfailing handhold. It's a Quranic expression that is very powerful. It is like holding on to a firm, literally it would read as a knot, but what it means is you're holding on to the firm covenant of your Lord. فَقَدْ اسْتَمْسَكَ بِالْعُرْوَةِ الْوُثْقَى, that the path to holding on to the firm covenant of your Lord is surrendering to Allah, but surrendering in ihsan. Okay, and then 23, that whoever turns away, we've encountered this several times where Allah is telling the Prophet, don't be dismayed by those who turn away. Okay. All right. So until we get to 27. So if you ask them who created the earth, these are, of course, those who did believe in God but didn't believe in an afterlife. Until we get to 27, which is a very famous verse of Surah Luqman. ولو أن ما في الأرض من شجرة أقلام والبحر يمده من بعده 7 أبحر ما نفدت كلمات الله إن الله عزيز حكيم. So, if all the trees were used to create pens. Or alternatively, in some tafsir say that if all the trees were pens, and the oceans of the world were ink, ما نفذت كلمات الله, Allah's wisdom would not run out, or Allah's knowledge would not run out. Inna Allah Azizun Hakim. Again, wisdom, Hakim. It is said that the Qurayshis taunted the Prophet saying, Ma aktharu kalimat Muhammad, that Muhammad speaks too much. And that then this was revealed in response. Although again, I'm very skeptical of that occasion for revelation. It is obviously the Qurayshis would object to the Quran that, oh, you know, when is he going to stop bringing this revelation to us? When is he going to stop talking? That's not surprising, because there's another report that it say Mata tanfuzu kalimatu Muhammad. When is he going to stop bringing this stuff to us? But this revelation as a direct response to these incidents is doubtful. Central theme that whatever wisdom you have, part of that wisdom is recognizing how infinite God's knowledge is. That what you know of in comparison is quite small. There's another report for those who said that this particular ayah was revealed, for those who said that this particular ayah was revealed in Medina, they often say that the following report, that the Jews of Medina go to the Prophet ﷺ and say, your Quran always emphasizes that what we know is limited. مَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. That what you as human beings know is limited. Does this apply to Muslims or does this apply to Jews? أَإِيَانَ تُرِيدْ أَمْ قَوْمَكَ. And the Prophet ﷺ responds and says, this applies to both of us, to all. Then, so they said, but didn't you say in the Quran, أن أوتينا التوراة وفيها تبيان كل شيء, that the Torah, in the Torah, is an exposition of everything. And the Prophet ﷺ reportedly then responds, yes, but the Quran does say that. Yes, but إِنَّهَا فِي عِلْمُ اللَّهِ قَلِيلٌ. Compared to God's knowledge, it's very little. And then that this Quranic verse about the seas being an ink to the Lord was revealed. Of course, you know, that incident takes place in Medina, and I don't think that this was revealed in response to something in Medina. I think this verse was revealed in Mecca, and that incident took place later on in Medina, but the verse applies to that. There is an interesting, narrative I want to tell you about, though. There's in Islamic theological texts, mostly, a discussion about that interaction that reportedly took place with Jews, where Jews are saying, well, it is the Torah that leads to truth. And so they're arguing with the Prophet that we don't need to look beyond the Torah for truth. So this is a quote from this discussion. It says, بل جميع الكتب والصحف المنزلة على عموم الرسل وقاطبة الأنبياء إذ كل ما دخل في حيطة الإنزال والإتيان وحضرة علمه سبحانه في نفسه غير مثنى ولا نسبة بين المثنى وغير المثنى بل علمه سبحانه بالنسبة إلى معلوم ومقدور واحد باعتبار شؤونه وتطوراته غير مثنى فكيف بعموم المعلومات والمقدورات. So what they're saying is that the argument where you are trying to say that a specific revealed book has all that needs to be learned is flawed, and that no revealed book has all that needs to be learned. But knowledge, God's knowledge, is far broader than any one book and must be pursued in all venues. I think that type of attitude is what led Muslims to lead a civilization. That realization that God's knowledge is beyond any one book or any one source, or is, anyway, among the interesting parts of tidbits of our tradition. Okay. Okay, so God's wisdom is infinitely larger than we will ever realize, portrayed in this powerful image of constant supply of ink writing down God's wisdom. And then Allah takes us to that theme of the extent to which human psychology is inconsistent. That when we are in trouble, we will turn to God fervently. And then when our circumstances change, our understanding of our gratitude itself changes. فَمِنْهُمْ مُقْتَصِد, there are some who are balanced, but many are not. وَمَا يَشْهَدُ بِآيَاتِنَا إِلَّا كُلُّ خَطَّارٍ كَفُورٍ. خَطَّارٍ كَفُور is where I want to pause for a second. So this is 32. How did they translate it? Translate perfidious, ungrateful. Yeah, I guess that's good. But Khattar Kafur, Khattar is a person who is especially treasures, that for God to describe human, this process as a form of khatr. It's not ghadr, but khatr. Means that someone who constantly betrays, time and time, goes back and forth. Now, what's among the perceptions that, among the elements that is significant here, is theologically, you often find a discussion on what is it that is at the heart of this treachery, this inability to stick to what you might at one point realize is owed gratitude. And among the most interesting theological discourses that you read here is that treachery is a form of lack of patience and perseverance. Is that most often people, their realization of gratitude, they tired of it. They just simply grow tired. And they don't, because they have not disciplined themselves to live by principle, their patience with morality wanes. So it is not necessarily that people intend to be immoral, but that their ability to persevere with moral principle is what weakens and wanes. And when that happens, is when they gravitate towards immorality again. Okay. Then Surah Luqman returns back again to the theme of the parent and the child. And again reminds us that, remember, with everything we've said about gratitude, one will not avail the other in the hereafter. Among the most interesting theological discourses is so many Muslim fuqaha write واتباع الرؤساء كاتباع الآباء المذموم, that if you follow leaders, rulers, blindly, it is as despicable as following your parents blindly. For all those, especially the fashion that is going on these days among so many of the American Muslim rulers, who tell you obey the ruler even if they tell you to do something wrong. It is remarkable that in our civilization, no, you don't even obey your parents if they tell you to do something wrong. And obeying rulers is even less so if they tell you something wrong. They're not owed obedience. فاتباع الرؤساء كاتباع الآباء المذموم. You can't, it's not going to avail you anything if in the hereafter you say, well, I did this because Sisi told me to do it, or because Hafiz al-Assad told me to do it, or because Trump told me to do it. That's not an excuse. In the same way that you can't say that my father isn't, or my parents told me to do it. Okay. فلا تغرنكم الحياة الدنيا. Do not be deceived by life on earth. ولا يغرنكم بالله الغرور. This is at 33. Just want to see how they deluder. So let not the life of this world delude you, nor let the deluder delude you concerning God. The deluder delude you. ولا يغرنكم بالله الغرور. No, the expression is fascinating. It's either, it can be read two ways. ولا يغرنكم بالله الغرور بالضم, or ولا يغرنكم بالله الغرور بالفتح. Do you notice the difference in vocalization? Al-ghurur versus al-gharur. And it's either, it would mean don't be deluded or don't be tricked by the deluder, here means the devil, or don't be tricked by delusion itself. Which means by wishful thinking that God is going to forgive your faults and your excesses. So, well, God is going to forgive me because I was just doing what my parents told me. Well, God is going to just forgive me because I was doing what my leader told me. That's gharur. Okay. إن الله عنده علم الساعة وينزل الغيث ويعلم ما في الأرحام وما تدري نفس ماذا تكسب غدا وما تدري نفس بأي أرض تموت إن الله عليم خبير. So ultimately Allah knows these, what Allah invokes as the time of the final day. Allah is the one that controls where Yanazul Ghais, where goodness falls, at وَيَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْأَرْحَامِ, and what will come through the process of birth of human beings. And ultimately, Allah, you don't know. You think you know. You make plans for the future, but you don't even know ultimately where fate is going to take you and which land you're going to die in. And we are reminded again, Inna Allah alimun khabir. So, what is the delivery of Surah Luqman? If you step back, Surah Luqman underscores the role of hikmah, of wisdom. And it tells you that wisdom is anchored, the idea that wisdom is cunning, being cunning, or that it is maximizing your advantage. That's not wisdom. Wisdom is anchored on virtue. And it's anchored on ihsan, and it's anchored on knowledge. And that, so on goodness, on a knowledge. And that the heart of wisdoms begins with these elementary relationships of gratitude and thankfulness, and a commitment to the principle of goodness itself, and a perseverance in the path of goodness itself. And that no attainment of wisdom is possible, or no attainment of knowledge, of true knowledge, and no attainment of ihsan, of goodness, is possible without humility. Now, in Surat Al-Baqarah, which is revealed, of course, significantly later on, we know that Allah tells us, وَمَنْ يُؤْتَ الْحِكْمَةَ فَقَدْ أُوتِيَ خَيْرًا كَثِيرًا, that whoever given wisdom is given a great deal of goodness. But that lesson was already understood by Muslims after Surah Luqman. That wisdom, and in fact the tradition that is often attributed to the Prophet, where it says, Al-Hikmah dallatul mu'min aynama wajadaha fahuwa ahaqqu biha, that wisdom is the province of a Muslim wherever a Muslim may find it. Muslim should pursue it. Reportedly that hadith was uttered in the context of Surah Luqman. Muslims clearly understood. I tend to believe that Surah Luqman is a late Meccan revelation. And I tend to believe that they clearly understood that on the path forward, it backs up the lessons that they receive from something like Surah Al-Ra'd and Surah Al-Isra, that this religion, this path, is a path not of the miraculous and the fantastical, not the stories that Al-Harith bin Nuller would convey of superstition, but of wisdom anchored in real knowledge, but anchored in moral virtue. And that you are required to pursue this wisdom through the vast oceans of knowledge symbolized by God's pens and ink. Because that's exactly the import of that image. When Muslims built Dar al-Hikmah, this vast library in Baghdad where they translated the works of Greek philosophers, they adorned Dar al-Hikmah with that verse. They understood that Surah Luqman is saying, you Muslims are not about superstition and fairy tales. You're about virtue and true knowledge. Another critical building block in the civilizational paradigm that Islam brought to humanity. Oh, I forgot one thing about, in discourses about hikmah, the nature of wisdom. In Surah Luqman, there are a lot written about that. I mean, Surah Luqman is often quoted in books of Kalam, books of Kalam, there are often these long discourses about the nature of wisdom. And you can always predict what ayat they're going to cite, and Surah Luqman is always center in this center place. And what they always say about the nature of wisdom is al-hikmah ilmul aham, that wisdom is the knowledge of priorities among things. So if you are unable to choose the more important, and you choose the less important, then you lack wisdom. But they say that for every system of priorities, there has to be what they often compared to a seed, like a code that upon which you build your system of priorities. So they say that you start out with the understanding shukrun ni'mah awla al-awlawiyat, that gratitude to Allah is the first priority. So you work out your system of priorities anchored in that moral virtue. So if then as you work out your system of priorities, you can't make gratitude of lesser importance. And the edifice of ethics and morality, and especially social morality, is built on relations. And relations have to have what we call in our language a civic logic to them. Because if they lack a civic logic, then relations fall apart. It is some of the most fascinating and also some of the most forgotten part of the Islamic tradition, these discourses in Kalam about how you start with a moral premise and then you build from that an entire moral system of ethics. And in Kalam, it was a point that you don't build a system of ethics based on naql, based on hadith, and based on text, but based on logic, which is fascinating, but also utterly forgotten by modern Muslims. But that's Surah Luqman, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.